Support Narativ's independent journalism at patreon.com/narrative and check out our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to subscribe and download. Hey everybody, welcome to Narativ Live. It's good to be with you. And hello, Eric Garland. How are you doing?
Hello, Ziv Shalev. How are you?
I'm really good. It's so nice to see you because I mean we've spoken before, but I've never actually had interactions. And here you are. You're Twitter famous, literally. You're one of the people who can be described as a Twitter celebrity.
Somewhere between that and $4 will get you a latte,
yeah,
and a lot of laughs. So,
well, maybe we'll get some tonight. For those people who don't know a lot about you, you describe yourself as a strategic intelligence analyst, which sounds very, very interesting, fascinating, and smart. But why don't you tell us exactly what that means?
So my job is doing analysis of huge sets of data about society, technology, economics, politics for leaders of business, government, intelligence agencies and whatnot, and been doing that for over 20 years now, so it's really sticking. And what happened that kind of projected me onto the Twitter sphere was on December 11th, 2016, about 4 days after the intelligence community ordered a full assessment of what just happened with Donald Trump's election and foreign powers. I wrote kind of a Cliff's Note version of what they came up with on 4 days after that, and it caught a lot of attention, good, bad, and indifferent. And ever since then, we've all been trying to make sense of the crazy world that we've inherited with as much fast-paced data as possible, and all these people who had something to give of their own expertise, have been offering it freely. That's become our little community on Twitter, trying to parse through public data and government reports and all that. So we're all just showing up to be citizens of a democracy, and I'm doing my part like everyone else. So.
It's one of the best gifts I think I've ever experienced in journalism is having this this community of people who are just desperately interested in finding the truths, and it's also the largest crowdsourced investigation ever. I think when you really think about the number of people who are involved in trying to get to the truth on the story, and it's remarkable to have everyone pitch it in the way they have. You've done phenomenal work in explaining a lot of this. Tonight we're going to try get some of your skills to look at Michael Flynn. There's a story about Michael Flynn that we all think we know. That's probably the one that's in the main narrative. There's also the story that you can learn about on Fox News. That's a whole other narrative. And then there's somewhere behind all of that, yet another story, which is probably closest to the truth, but it's hard to get at that very easily. So what we're going to do today is try unpack some of this. And the reason why I think it's so important to do this. We've let Barr get away with a lot of things over the last year. We understood that he was covering up on the Mueller report. Then we let him do the same with Stone. Now we're doing the same thing with Flynn. And we sort of are getting to a point where rule of law really is being challenged. I mean, at some point, you can't say that you're going to keep politics out of the Department of Justice if you're doing all these actions. And he seems to be continuing to do these actions. Now, I know there was a development today. You pointed out earlier that Shea,
he's been the interim United States attorney after Barr got rid of Jesse Liu, right. And Brandon Van Grack, the prosecutor from who's at the National Security Division, who prosecuted Flynn, resigned from the case because Barr was putting in Shea as a replacement to do exactly what he wanted, essentially what looks like obstruction to any honest person. Only 24 to 48 business hours after Judge Sullivan in that case said, "Oh, are you going to come in and try and renegotiate a guilty plea with my court? Okay, well, let's open up amicus briefs. Oh, who do we have on deck? The Watergate prosecutors. Come on in, folks. Is it time for alternative points of view? Well, there's plenty of people with expertise. Let's bring in the Watergate prosecutors. Oh, you know what? I have to take myself out of this. I don't want this to seem biased since you're kind of insinuating that with your nonsense here. Let's get an amicus curiae. maybe Judge John Gleason is retired. You remember him from the Eastern District of New York, that would have Brighton Beach and all the Russian mafiosi. Oh, what was his claim to fame as a prosecutor before he became a federal judge? That's right. He took down the Gambinos, Colombos, and John Gotti.
Should
All the
we?
more the merrier. And 24 hours later, Mr. Shea decides to, I don't know if he's opening a golf shop or is gardening. I don't know what he's doing, but he left the scene pretty quickly.
He thought he should. He was going to lose his job regardless. But still, that is good news for those of us who still believe that there is rule of law and a sign that it is still functioning effectively. So today, let's go through what happened. November 8th, let's start there and go step by step as we look at what Michael Flynn did during this whole process. Now, November 8th was the election. 2 days later, Obama warns Donald Trump that it's not a good idea to hire Michael Flynn. He had concerns about him. He had issues with him. Can you tell our viewers a little bit more about what Michael Flynn and Obama broke up over?
Well, first, to get the full context of what's happened with Michael Flynn becoming an unregistered foreign agent for hostile powers after being at the head of one of our defense intelligence agencies. It's really without any form of precedent in terms of the people who take the oath to the Constitution of the United States. Michael Flynn had a 33-year career in intelligence beginning, I believe, in 1982. And he had many senior positions wherever he was at, not just doing analytical intelligence in the back room somewhere, but operationalizing it in the combat theater. He's a man with 3 master's degrees, and he worked up the chain to one of the highest positions possible. And somebody else who had that job before he did was James Clapper, who's had a 55-year career in intelligence and became director of national intelligence. That's the kind of the rarefied air where Mike Flynn was. And, some of the backstory that precedes him becoming friendly with Russia, too friendly, and as we now know, very open to working with other governments other than the United States. You have this illustrious career with quite a few intellectual things that he'd given the community in terms of, really advancing the field of making intelligence work on the battlefield to get bad guys and save lives.
Yeah, he did some really good, impressive stuff, didn't he? I mean, at the end of the day, before he turned whatever he turned, he did some decent work out there.
I mean, one of his papers that people in my field would recognize, I think the metaphor they use is ghost hunting, about really rolling intelligence of figuring out where you need to collect from in an urban environment where you might have, insurgents and terrorists, and how do you feed that back into the bigger intelligence loop. In other words, this is a true professional who works with SAME and got the recognition of presidents. And then I think the common story is around the time Stanley McChrystal, his mentor, or at least a very close colleague of his, was dismissed summarily by Obama following a very unflattering piece in Rolling Stone about the leadership over in Afghanistan, in which I believe McChrystal was quoted being very harsh in his criticisms of the president. And in
He
the
wasn't
United
alone.
States,
He wasn't alone at the time, and there were a lot of people criticizing the president at that time.
of course not, but when, any president, but when you're a general officer, we have the principle of civilian leadership. And so people who are high level officers, and even, anybody enlisted or officer class, they're not going to comment on politics because we are not Myanmar. We are not North Korea, and we have civilian control of the military. So everyone knows, they're trained. You do not speak in public about your political opinion. That happened. McChrystal was dismissed, and Flynn apparently was very incensed by this, and that set him on quite a path. And he actually became director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is the Pentagon's direct intelligence agency that has responsibility for assessing the kinetic, particularly capabilities, i.e., what they can blow up and hit us with.
Why did Flynn get so upset about what happened to McChrystal?
I mean, I think if you had somebody who was a close colleague, if not mentor or friend, who you felt got a raw deal, you might be very angry with what happened to that person. I don't know enough about their personal relationship, and I don't have a comment on whether anybody was justified. But you can see that these are just people, and if somebody that you worked with and you felt deserved more than just a summary dismissal.
Right.
You might become very angry, and apparently he became more radical over time and got really into a very partisan worldview. In this case, right wing. As an intelligence professional myself, I just see the extremes of politics in terms of the horseshoe, which is Russian military science for getting people in a single culture to argue as if they're not citizens all in the same republic.
Right.
That they love that part. They love to do that, and that's why they put the extreme left in and the extreme right in multiple countries for a century. So I don't care which side you go down. If you're going down a side and not looking critically, particularly if you are in the business of intelligence and you are taught that this is how this works, to get super partisan is kind of considered an analytical weakness. I saw it, my time in DC for 20 years, I saw starting in the late 90s, it was being partisan in the government, much less in the intelligence world, was really considered gauche. It was like, do you really believe the puppet show? Do you not get it? Like, especially if anybody had clearance and knew secret things, it's like every story, every narrative that you ran into was not like it was on the news. You were seeing behind the curtain. You were seeing what the real mechanism was, and you even understood why that needed to be compartmented, because if such a thing was broadly known, there could be major damage either to United States interests or allied interests, or just in general, people could get hurt. Or mostly one of the reasons that we handle these things with such care is you don't know how important something is. And so that's why when you have a job like this, you really treat it with a lot of respect in terms of what information you let out, who you talk to. And Mike Flynn, we end up, when we come into this story November 8th, he has really gone out on a real extreme. But there are stories of him bringing very partisan information into his workspace, and even a story, I believe, of him trying to get a consumer-grade internet line put in at the Pentagon, which I think was a very confusing order, since their IT is really well controlled. And it's like, wait a minute, what do you want? ESPN in here? What's going on? So
somehow he turned, but we don't know how he turned. We just know that he got somehow infected by the wrong kind of information, or something made him believe that the United States was on the wrong path.
He started going off, I think, around the time he was dismissed by President Obama and he retired. And then after that, that's when he started doing the really unthinkable things, like going and making plans with hostile foreign intelligence services. And, just for the viewers' sake, understand that if you just have a regular security clearance, you are very, very careful about every part of your personal life, every part of how you comport yourself in public, everything down to your finances, your appearance at casinos, your social life to a degree. They're looking to make sure that you don't have something that can be a source of compromise.
Your appearances matter, your finances matter. These things are important to keep your security clearance. Otherwise, you're easily compromised. So let's turn to this period of time. November 10th, Obama gives a warning to Trump. He obviously ignores that because 8 days later, Trump appoints Flynn his national security advisor. This was enough to set off alarm bells, you would think. I mean, this would be enough to make anybody in the White House go, didn't he just tell you about this last week?
More than that, I mean, the people in the intelligence community, people in my community, in mid-2016, when we saw Mike Flynn, poke his head up, we're like, wait a minute, he's been hanging out over in Russia, and that's an insane situation. If you consider that the standard for the regular person is making sure they don't do too many scratchers tickets, the lottery. He's hanging out with Vladimir Putin. Where did he come from? Where did we get any of these clowns? And this guy is dangerous. And then when it was announced, oh yeah, he's going to be national security advisor, it was like, what?
And
That is a very bad thing.
and the president of the United States, the then sitting president of the United States, was right to be concerned about, this potential Putin plant in the executive branch, and raised it with the incoming
Yes.
president, who should have been equally as concerned about someone like that in his administration, you would think.
Agreed.
But
You would think.
But over on the Fox narrative, when you look at their newscast every night, you'd think that something untoward was being done by just trying to secure the country against this national security threat.
Oh, well, he was just, if you take that story that they're trying to push, this could happen to anyone.
Yeah.
Really? Just everyone has a 33-year career in intelligence and made it to the top of one of 17 agencies? Okay. He was just sitting there, talking to the Russian ambassador about, don't worry about those sanctions. We'll take care of those in a few weeks, as one does. I mean, who hasn't interfaced with the sitting ambassador of our historic, counterintelligence adversary? I mean, who doesn't call them at Christmas on vacation and talk sanctions?
Exactly. So there's absolutely no rational reason for anyone to be saying that Obama was out of his out of scope here. And really what he did at the end of the day was just ask people to be very conscious, as far as we know so far, of what they're sharing with the incoming administration.
They just released an unclassified, or I should say declassified, email from Susan Rice, who is the outgoing national security advisor, and it is a memo of some discussions inside the executive branch with James Comey saying, yeah, we have some major reservations that include what can we share with these folks. That is the most conservative, gentle way I could imagine it being put, because, everyone's hair was on fire. Our hair was on fire outside of the Situation Room. But, at the end of the day, you have a guy who they know is on the payroll of hostile foreign powers.
Had already been given money, and it was paid $50,000 just to go and sit next to Putin. So God knows what else he's getting. Okay, let's go back to this timeline here then briefly. So we're on to December the 1st. So Kushner and Flynn meet Kislyak at Trump Tower. This is a meeting we don't hear about until much later on, but then it turns out that they did meet. I think Kushner said I asked if they had an existing communications channel at his embassy we could use. This is that meeting. This is the meeting when he asked about, can I have a back channel? Is that possible? So treasonous, really.
Well, it doesn't look very good. Kislyak apparently came in like the side elevator, so he avoided the hullabaloo of walking in the front door. Right. And, understand that just generally when a new administration comes in, they're in Washington, they're given office space and the transition. And, eventually the Trump people started making their way down there, but they started out hanging out at Trump Tower almost as if they didn't really expect to win and didn't know how anything should work. And I was calling people, this is how I kind of ended up with my view by December 11th, 2016, talking to people going, how's it going down there? Oh, they're holed up in Trump Tower. What do you mean? They didn't go to the Pentagon. They didn't go to the State Department to make their diplomatic calls in order to our allies. It's like, nope. It's like, wow, okay. No, they're just hanging out at Trump Tower taking like random meetings. And there you've got Al Gore and I think Kanye West or whatever. It was a real zoo. But in the side door comes the Russian ambassador, Sergei Kislyak, and we now have, I believe, some FBI 302s that have been declassified, as well as House Intelligence Committee transcripts. And yeah, you see Jared Kushner very breezily explaining, yeah, well, we were, Sergei came by, and I mean, who wouldn't want to be friendly? Well, you guys there's a difference between like saying hi and when you've known each other before perhaps, but talking specific policy is a no-no because there's already an administration in place. But having secret meetings with the Russian ambassador and then saying, can we use secure Kremlin communications so we can back channel to Putin, which I believe everybody says Kislyak wisely was like, no, you're insane. Of course you can't.
Let's talk about Jared Kushner here a little bit, because Jared's an unelected official. Here he is meeting with an ambassador from an enemy state, and he's also going to land up having this incredible portfolio that includes all these other big projects that he has, and he has no experience whatsoever. That's a very dangerous meeting to be had. Someone who has no experience in the world of a government, and then someone who's probably compromised by the Russians.
Yes, not a good thing. Flynn, who I'll be charitable and say, I think his worldview really got ahead of him. Sometimes when we are not thinking clearly, we can get ourselves in more danger than we understand.
Mhm.
And Kushner, for his part, is a man that understood to his degree the world of New York metro real estate with the money coming from outside. But
Mhm.
anybody who spends time in DC tells you, or can tell you, that humility is really important. And there's a process when you get to Washington. You start forming up some opinions about how this works and that works. And the seniors, both men and women, will smack you down and
Mhm.
demonstrate for you in the most stark terms, in ways that hopefully, if you're going to stick around, you'll learn quickly just how little you know and just
Mhm.
how dangerous you are if you go off on your own knowledge, which isn't very much. And it teaches you a hierarchy and to be curious. And Mr. Kushner didn't and still doesn't appear to have much of that. So he's like, sure, we'll just meet with people, we do a deal. It's like, man, everything you do now is under a microscope and being recorded. So this
Mhm.
is not, we went out to Joey's, they've got great ossobuco, and we met with the guy, and he's got another guy that's from the United Arab Emirates. He's going to chuck in, he's got like 100 mil for the fund. We're good, and we'll get that bada bing, bada boom, Jersey style.
It's not
That's
so hard
not this,
stuff.
man. No,
So you've
we
got
are now official.
now he does have some government experience that he knows Bibi Netanyahu quite well. I mean, really well. Other than the sleepovers at the Kushner's household was one thing, but beyond that, they seem to have been pretty close over a long period of time, which should have added another sort of red flag to the situation, you would think.
Is being either the intelligence target of or asset of a foreign government, friendly or not. I guess that's one form of government experience. It's not the same thing as rising to the SES senior executive service level at the U.S. government, but it is certainly important. And I think, if we didn't have some curiosity around this before, the fact that we now have Rod Rosenstein's declassified memo saying what Robert S. Mueller III was allowed to look at from DOJ's perspective in the beginning of the Mueller investigation, that it involved George Papadopoulos
Mm.
not merely kicking around London looking for Russians to meet on behalf of Trump, but specifically the question, was he an agent of Israel?
Mm.
And that was one of the first times I've seen something tied to what has become colloquially known as Trump Russia,
Mm.
say, and tell us about Israeli agents.
Well,
And
it's interesting because Mueller, in the Mueller report, Mueller does actually say that they investigated Papadopoulos for being an Israeli agent. They don't reach a conclusion, but just the fact that they included it as a possibility is enough of an indication they were taking it seriously. Then you've got George Nader, who a lot of people seem to associate him with the UAE and MBZ, but he's also got a history with Netanyahu as well, back to his early days as Israeli prime minister the first time around. And Nader has been an emissary for him for a very long time. You add the Epstein thing on top of all of this, and now you've got potentially quite a few agents running around this Trump Russia operation that belong to Israel.
indeed,
And that's an interesting parallel as well with Flynn and Epstein, just to pose something here at the start of the blue. In that we've seen Epstein, who's an Israeli agent, he's not getting prosecuted posthumously or before that, and now Flynn looks like he's getting off. And I'm not saying Flynn is an agent of anyone other than, he's the agent of Israel, but there's a sense that Barr is letting some people off the hook who might be otherwise associated with foreign governments and foreign intelligence.
I'd say offhand, Barr looks like he is increasingly arduous in his attempt to cover up as much information as possible about people with connections to foreign governments and a certain, I'm not going to say the Israeli government because it's a free democracy,
Mm-hmm.
and they certainly have enough elections these days. You never know who they could vote in next, but the Bibi Netanyahu administration / regime, that there is, look, when you see Harvey Weinstein using Israeli, either, ex-Israeli Defense Forces operatives on U.S. soil,
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's a very serious thing. I think for the folks that are watching the, this program right now, understand that we have links with other countries when it comes to intelligence, but especially with our allied friends, there is really an understanding that listening on anyone's soil can be a good thing, as in they could be catching things on our home soil we might not catch. So if you're listening, even as an ally, that's not considered the worst thing in the world. But kinetic operations, people moving around in the black of night, or what's known as black ops, when you're, like, say, kidnapping someone, like Mike Flynn was promising to do on behalf of Turkey, or what Black Cube was doing, apparently intimidating actresses into not talking about what they knew about Harvey Weinstein and his associates. That's a very serious diplomatic breach right there. And normally that would be accompanied by summoning an ambassador, the revelation that, wait a minute, you have operatives on our soil harassing U.S. persons or U.S. citizens. Come here, we want to talk to you. That is a big deal. And that, I think, if we were more articulate about that in bigger, mainstream media sources, maybe people would have gotten a sense of, wow, we have a lot of questions to ask about what Israel is doing here, because we find out Black Cube had office space that was like in IDF government real estate. Like, they're not so very different, because we all have mercenaries. I mean, for thousands of years, you have soldiers that go off and do a thing for money later, but being under the auspices of a government is very complicated. So we've had that now, and we've known about that for years. But now I think what you're seeing with the revelations and the different documents being declassified, we now have not just a lot of questions about Russia, many of which are answered, but we have a whole lot about Israel, many of which are not answered.
Right. And I think there's, if there's been I don't know if it's an attempt, because it certainly doesn't feel coordinated. There's just sort of a sensitivity around how much Israel criticism you can put out there. Because if you do, it tends to inflame sort of anti-Semitic responses in whatever communities that, those things tend to show up. So there's a sensitivity around, can we put this in the media? But maybe too much sensitivity, because we've left so much out of the narrative that you start looking at it and you're saying, well, there's just too many holes here. Where does can you exclude the fact that Joel Zammel came to meet with Don Trump Jr. in August 9th in Trump Tower and discussed social manipulation of the American public during the election? Can you just leave that out and say, well, that's not Israel, that's MBS and MBZ. It's not Israel. It's impossible to do that, because Zammel worked, came out of the IDF, came out of that grouping within the IDF that did all this high-tech surveillance and manipulation. So that seems to be like an operation that came out of the IDF, or certainly an allied private organization. And, as we continue to go through, it's interesting to see where we could find some other interesting places where Israel might have come up. So speaking of which, here's the UN resolution. It's December the 22nd, and multiple members, this is reading from Mueller here, multiple members of the transition team, as well as President-elect Trump, communicated with foreign government officials to determine their views on the resolution and to rally support to delay the vote to defeat the resolution. Kushner led the effort for the transition team. Flynn was responsible for the Russian government. Minutes after an early morning phone call with Kushner on December the 22nd, Flynn called Kislyak. According to Flynn, he informed Kislyak about the vote and the transition team's opposition to the resolution, and requested that Russia vote against or delay the resolution. Later that day, President-elect Trump spoke with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi about the vote. Ultimately, Egypt postponed the vote for a day or two, I think it was. But this is probably the cornerstone of the Flynn investigation. It comes right down to two things that he did. He spoke to Kislyak about sanctions, but he also initially spoke to Kislyak about this resolution, which was going before the United Nations. Obama had agreed to let the vote go ahead. And this, of course, upset Bibi Netanyahu tremendously. Bibi and Obama had never gotten along well. This was viewed by the Bibi government as a bit of a stab in the back as he was leaving office by Obama. Might have in fact been a little, you haven't helped me very much. Here's what you can get. But so they had a vote ultimately, and the vote went through. But this intervention of first Kushner, then Flynn to intervene while there was a sitting president is in fact illegal.
Yes.
And so tell us,
illegal.
It's illegal because of the Logan Act.
It is, and which has been, not prosecuted very much or at all, but also we've had a lot of things during the Trump era that have been mostly kept together by tradition, as in, yes, there are laws in the books, or maybe there aren't, but these things take care of themselves because they would be so on their face bad and wrong that we haven't had to worry about it. So the notion of there being one president at a time and us having, for example, a lot of pomp and circumstance about turning over the power of the White House peacefully, with it the nuclear launch codes and the world's most powerful military, we go to great pains to go, this person's in power, now this person's in power. And they meet with their spouses and there's handshakes. There's not, a paramilitary group that seizes the radio station and says, we're declaring it's year zero of this new republic. That's not what we do. So one president at a time, and that is legally sealed by the Logan Act, but I don't believe it had ever been tested. But this time it got tested because Flynn and Kushner did not wait, and they started conducting foreign policy on their own while there was already a group of Americans duly elected and already sworn in that were conducting their own foreign policy. So it was
completely contradictory. I mean, they were doing different things against each other. This was not just them, freelancing on something that the Obama administration was not working on. This was something.
And only one side was teamed up with the Russians, going, "What do you guys want? What do you need?"
Right. And would you please? So, and teamed up with Israel, actually. Well, I should say more accurately, teamed up with Bibi Netanyahu, because the request came from Bibi Netanyahu to stop this vote or move it along. It was their interests that Trump and Kushner and Flynn were protecting when they decided to intervene, before being elected or before being sworn in. So that's a significant. It's not just Russia; it's Israel that was doing that.
And what I also find interesting from that clip that you just put up, the quote from the Mueller report, is how the linchpin was Egypt. And Trump talked to Egypt. I just got done looking at thousands of pages of the House Intelligence Committee transcripts that were declassified. And I thought that the Simona Mangiante transcripts would be kind of light and not that substantive, 40, 50 pages compared to everyone else's 250. No, hers was 222 pages about what her either soon-to-be husband or recently betrothed George Papadopoulos was up to in Europe. And she was very articulate about the fact that, he was there to get connections going between Trump and Putin, maybe a meeting, like he had with al-Sisi in Egypt. He'd already done that, and now he's there to complete the loop there. So you've got this very, very complicated set of alliances there that are not evident to the average person just from reading the news. So you have some people that are very, very friendly with Russia, if not Russian money at least. Then you have, Jared Kushner's noted connections to Bibi Netanyahu. So you have some working alongside Israel there, but you also have an Egypt connection, and they're all working together to delay a vote in the United Nations. Only one group of these people are about to inherit the White House from the other group that already has the White House and is trying to conduct U.S. foreign policy without the no doubt well-meaning help of the Russian Federation in making those decisions. So it's kind of sticky.
Support Narativ's independent journalism at patreon.com/narrative. and check out our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to subscribe and download.